Good morning and good day or good evening, whoever will be joining remotely. And it is regrettable that I couldn't make it in person in Arusha, but the next one is definitely guaranteed. It's on the card, since this year where I'm staying in Johannesburg, South Africa. Yeah, so today I'll actually be kind of like covering the feedback from the work stream for code security and quality. And in there is really kind of like a multitask work stream that really brings together, all the role players within the Mojo community and ensure that we actually run security as more of an integrated effort across all. So although I'm the presenter today, but the work that we'll be seeing is actually many more people that I can acknowledge. And the list, the ones mentioned here, but many more that are involved in this, including other, work streams and also including other governance committees. And in terms of the mission, we always kind of like, reflect on this just to make sure that is there anything we need to adjust, or are we actually executing according to what we initially thought? So we tend to actually, ensure that we want to make sure the trust of the system is, of the best quality standard possible. And through that, we'll actually gain confidence from the adopters, that, the security of the system is enough for them to use it in productive environment, because this is where the money exchange is actually happens. So trust is really, really important. So we do that by, looking at all the functionality as well as non-functionality requirements of the project, and work with all the rest of the teams on the project to ensure that we integrate that deep into what we do. And the shared responsibility model is our anchor of our approach, and we have achieved much using it, and with very less friction. So in a standard organization, issues such as this will create a lot of friction, but I commend the team in terms of ensuring that this actually happens with much more or less frictions between all different members. And our approach has always been looking at the standards and the controls that are out there that are known, and these are the things that will also be expected to have as a Mojo look. And we're going a little bit more deeper since we're an open source project to ensure that there's no kind of like a rejection of this based on the fact that the security of it is open. But having agreed and talked about this, Mila is actually one of the person that actually advocated for that we will keep everything transparent and open and not use obscurity as our security. So whatever we're doing, we will take the standards that are known and we will build our own standards that are relevant to us, and we'll make all that public for anybody to see. Then that actually creates an open model for people to contribute. And through that, we got a lot of contributions from people that actually identify issues, they actually privately raise it with us. So the model of actually making sure that all the controls we put into the system are open is actually working for us. In terms of the risk-centric model, from time to time, we perform, risk assessments and threat modeling just to keep up with the changing threat landscape. But however, we also leverage our, community of implementers. So they perform this thing from time to time, and they share with us anything that will actually be kind of like problematic for them to resolve on their own. And they feel that this actually requires us as an upstream to be able to resolve it. So this approach in terms of addressing our key objective is working for us. So in terms of the milestone, there's a lot we could share in terms of where we started, what we have built in, and today in kind of like phase 5, we are continuing to actually enhance what we had and ensuring that we embed this. And VNext was one of our kind of like biggest focus in the last kind of like 3 or 4 or 5 years, and we aligned with it and redefine the security architecture that goes with it, and implementation of that is of our cuts. So the implementation team has that guidance, has that architecture, and they're actually doing their work on that. So you will see in today's talk, I will actually kind of like have removed everything that do with VNext, and then just goes in looking at the Mojo Loop platform, be it the current version, which is in productive in some of our customers, and also the future version. So everything that we're doing now is really covering both. So in terms of the objectives, we set for, this one was for PS17. We had an addition of a fraud and risk management system, which was a standalone system, but wanted to ensure that we bring the security of it to more or less the same level as Mojo Loop, if not better. and also ensure that the integration of that into Mojo Loop is actually, up to kind of like best practice standards. So that's actually what we actually focus on. This is really going to be similar if there's any other big functionality addition, and this big functionality addition can be a contribution. So, any of the contributors can say we have a substantial, model to add into the, Mojo Loop ecosystem, and we'll actually follow the same kind of like review and validation process just to ensure that it doesn't compromise the security of our ecosystem, and we don't compromise, some of the principles that were developed, for it. And the second part is really in what we're doing just to do vulnerability management on the current ecosystem and do process policy and tool enhancement on our, dev factories. This is very important because this is where, the project will spend most of its lifespan, and, with more and more contributions coming in from more and more people. So we hope that the framework we've developed is actually kind of like going to get us much more far, but there's a lot of changes that happens in there. So we're not going to let it off and rest on our laurels. So we do a lot of, checks in terms of the threat landscape. What are the latest attacks in the kind of like, open source ecosystem, and we adapt, these processes and policies that we have to respond to those. And also, very important, in line with our open source policy, we like to try to make everything as freely available for anybody to use in their own project. We perform, quarterly OSS Scan just to make sure that we don't have any license that is not in compliance with our license policy, and then also to ensure that all the open source components and libraries that we use are not vulnerable and also up to date. So this is in a nutshell what we focus on in PS17. And just apologies for moving ahead a bit on it, but I'll be taking you through each of this at very high level, and we'll actually see how much we have achieved in each. In terms of RFMS security, working with the RFMS team, this has been a multi-PI, kind of like a sprint. And where we are now, we are in the last phase of it because we're developing their beta versions. And that was the end of the much of the work that we have done with them. So in here, what we have achieved here is really kind of like reviewed and validated and input into their design with security requirements and control, and also looked at the resultant implementation to ensure that all the agreements that we had in terms of the security control have been implemented. And the second part was really the OSS Scan to make sure that we scan their code and we aligned to the open source policy that we have within Mojo Loop to ensure that there are no restrictive licenses that are embedded into the code, and that all the components are free of known vulnerabilities. So we achieved both, starting with the security review. And this is really kind of like it sets a framework that we will leverage. And however, we try not to impose a large set of requirements, common requirements to any, contribution that we bring or any addition that we bring. So we custom tune this based on what functionality is doing and how is it doing it, and what type of data and compliance requirements will be needed for that. And the biggest focus is really the things that once they are developed into the application, there's no way that the adopters will be able to change it, or if they change it, they will actually not going to be able to, benefit from subsequent upstream changes. So we want to make sure that whatever is actually embedded is actually kind of like ensuring that the upgrades will be successful and the developers and the adopters don't have to develop that on their own. So here I just sampled the top 6, of the requirements that we had kind of like discussions with to ensure they're embedded, and what has been done and what reference implementation we actually, received from, the RFMS team. So starting from ensuring that, authentication is actually, well embedded, all the authentication controls from password management, role management, two-factor authentication. So those are really the aspects of security that we actually want to make sure that they are embedded as the base controls, and they actually should be provided flexibly. But what is very important is, anybody should be able to use these base controls and apply their own policy. With regards to passwords, it should not be kind of like restricted to any size or any length or any complexity. This will actually be a policy-driven decision that the implementers will do. The same as the role management aspects of it. We actually keep it open to say any role, and permission system that you like to define on the platform should be accommodated in there. And then of course, the reference implementation will have specific components that, are being used today, such as Azure and Keycloak. But this reference implementation components could be replaced with any tool that perform the same function. So seeing them there is really, the fact that, they have to make choices here and there. And these choices are flexible enough to be kind of like replaced with whatever implementers prefers. But overall, in terms of the standard protocols, we want to make sure that we support, things like TLS, anything from version 1.2, and we depreciate anything that is kind of like not supported or not, secure enough, like 1.1. Certificate-based, PK infrastructure, keep it, flexible, keep it open for certificates to be actually used anyhow within the platform, but avoid self-signed certificates from the core, so that those actually will cause problematic actions when actually they're actually used within the core, but nobody knows about them. So when they start expiring, they might actually cause system failure. So those were some of the checks that we really focused on and ensure that they are not there. Overall, we also wanted to make sure that the base platform has cloud security measures built in. And if somebody spin it off on Azure platform, then those features will actually be standard in there that could be leveraged from day one. Because for smaller fintech providers or people that don't have much more larger infrastructure team, this will really come handy to get this out of the box platform that can actually easily be run and secured. So that is really in a nutshell on the security requirements that come standard with the RFMS platform. Moving quickly into the outcome of the OSS scan. In here, the code base is still kind of like, averagely small, although there's no normal in software development. 42 repositories with about 593 libraries. They've done very well in terms of compliance with the license requirements of Mojo, and there were no licenses that reflect that could be risky, like AGPL or GPL, which is good. And in terms of the vulnerable libraries, there were 15 libraries that had high vulnerabilities, and the team has actually turned it around to fix all of them. So the output of this is really kind of like 15 high issues that needed to be resolved, and overall those were actually resolved. In terms of the version management, making sure that all the libraries leverage are up to date. They're doing very well, out of those 593, and almost 90% of those libraries are updated, and only 25 that it actually requires to be updated. And although they are not updated, there's no vulnerabilities associated with those. Great. Moving into the scan on the Mojo repos themselves. So we started kind of like tracing this, shortly, previous PIs. I just want to reflect only one PI back. What we could see here is really a steady growth in terms of the code base. So we started on about 104 this year, and about 7,055 libraries, and we're steadily growing the number of the code base, the number of the libraries, which actually is connected to the increase with the lines of code. And that actually shows that there's contribution. And in terms of the output, in terms of outdated libraries, updated libraries, the team is doing very well. So almost over 80, 85, to 90% of the libraries are updated, and with very few libraries to worry about. And we also kind of like looked into the comparison chart, for white source. They have a benchmark database that we could use to see how good are we doing and how bad are we doing. And comparatively, we're doing better than average, both on the number of vulnerable libraries as well as the outdated libraries, which is a really, really good sign. The result overview, really doing it comparatively from January, we had a lot of kind of like security, vulnerabilities to deal with. And we had a couple of, 14 and 20, medium risk licenses. So we actually kind of like, improved drastically in April, wherein we moved, to, nothing on the license risk. All the GPL and AGPL licenses, we investigated them, and much of those were not in the core repositories, and we excluded from the scan and ensuring that the output of the scan is not really, tainted by things that are not relevant. So we've done a lot of work, and the improvements actually shows for itself. And the next one, we hope that all the security risk will actually go lower, and nothing should be introduced on the license. But if it gets introduced, it's really because there's new code being added. It may not necessarily mean a bad thing, but just for something for us to pay attention to. Okay, so moving quickly into the vulnerability management and the DevSec processes. This is really the crux of our kind of like DevOps processes, and ensuring that security is embedded in here. That will actually help us to have a resultant quality, high quality, high security, code base that could be trusted. So we do regular things, just to make sure that security patches, are in place where they are disclosed, and any kind of like of our implementers really can highlight anything that they pick that we don't pick. And we've been getting a lot of those. So we've been getting a lot of free kind of like people contributing, having a look at the alerts that they run against our code base, or during the time they install it themselves, they pick something. We're getting a lot of those alerts, and the DevOps team is actually working to really making sure that they're addressed as soon as possible. We do a lot of prioritization for those. So there might be one or two that are kind of like medium or even high that you may not see being resolved. But in terms of the importance, we had a look and get the level of priorities on there. So we do a lot of improvements around, workflows and introducing policies, but we're very, careful in terms of not introducing too many governance gates. So in a project such as this, you want as much as contribution as possible. We will make sure that we balance in between having our checks to be sufficient enough to get the quality, but also not to overburden the free developers in there. So we're actually kind of like cognizant of those critical issues. So moving into some of the activities, I've already mentioned the independent scan. The independent scan is really over and above what we're doing. So with every pull request, once a month, we do kind of like run our own, scripts, using our license checkers. We do run a lot of stuff, just to ensure that, there are no vulnerabilities using NPM audit and other tools, like Sneak. But, once a quarter, we bring the scan, and this is run independently just to make sure that what we're doing is really kind of like, up to standards. And also, we're using Node, so this is the biggest kind of like a core of our platform. And we really looked at the version upgrade strategy. So, all the teams were collaboratively working through the DA, and the issue was there, everybody who wants to look at the outcome of that can go there on maybe contribute or give feedback on what has been agreed. But this has actually been kind of like agreed upon, and the implementation of the node operational strategy is really ongoing. And also we looked at our code security framework as a whole. So as it stands today, we focus much more on dependencies, on the packages we bring, open source libraries. We're doing extremely well on that, but we haven't yet interrogated custom code that we're writing as the core team, and also custom code that could come from contribution. So we like to develop a standard that is actually talks to us, not really throw in some of the open standards such as OWASP or SANS. They may not necessarily be completely relevant or give us the things that we like to see. But with this, we like to make sure that things that are malicious don't find themselves in our code, and that will actually end up contributing to our platform not being trustworthy. So that standard is actually being still in develop. So for those that wants to contribute, there's an issue number there. You can go in there, look at what we actually have as the framework and contribute to it. The other part is really was around code integrity assurance. And for people downloading the code, using it, and making sure that we could actually sign, where we need, to sign the Helm charts and give guarantees of, integrity. And that is actually ongoing, and the solution phase is actually towards the end. And we're just about to, test one of few methods that we could actually, use, starting with the Helm charts, which is the top level, of people coming to, download our code. That is actually ongoing, and we should be able to close it in the next, few days. And also, in terms of general improvements for security, we look at GitHub, strongly. They've got lots of tools. and they make these tools available to us as an open source project. So, recently, we had kind of like an update with the head of DevSecOps at GitHub, and some of the key recommendations that came there was to look at code secret scanning, which is actually a commercial tool that GitHub is selling, but that will actually be available for us to use, and as well as a static code security testing tool called QL. And that is actually will be available freely for us to really use it. And once we have our code security standard established, and we'll start running our first tests wherein we can just see what is in there. And over a long period of time, we'll start kind of like enforcing that and making sure that people are aware of the standards we need and they should adhere to them so that the code doesn't get flagged or rejected or somehow. So that is in a nutshell, the activities that we have been kind of like ongoing, have been touching in. And we're much more open, especially from the implementation teams, in Myanmar or Wali or any teams to contribute to this and highlight anything that are important for their DevOps factories that we're not addressing, and we're happy to do that. And lastly, it was also an issue of the dependency chain. So as you might be aware that in today's world, the software is really kind of like highly dependent on objects that are built by others, and we're using that as a dependency chain. And up to kind of like, according to the research, up to 80%, of the code base is leveraging these dependencies. And we have seen a spate of attacks, in that trust chain, wherein malicious code are inserted in dependencies that people don't control. And that actually affects us, as Mojo Loop, we actually taking this kind of like seriously. And our platform is actually based on the node. So we're looking deeply in terms of what can we leverage from node so that the solutions we put in can natively integrate with what we have, doesn't introduce lots of breaking changes, and it can easily be enabled there. But over and above that, the implementation team can go for other commercial tools that are available and to complement what we've already done. So in this, we're exploring a lot of features around this, and this is ongoing on our side, and we'll never close it. We'll always be looking at what are the latest supply chain attacks and ensuring that the measures that we have are sufficient enough to block those. So there's an issue we opened under the DA, and we'll actually continue to look at, how best can we, refine our prevention mechanism and not actually close the door completely to anything that could help us in this space. So yeah, that actually completes what we have done. In terms of the next PI, what we'll continue to do is the quarterly OSS Scan, and also we'll continue to do the maintenance and enhancements of our DevSecOps, environment. Then the documentation is also one of the things that we were lacking a little bit behind, because we're adding far more than we could document, engage with the implementers. But next PI will have a much more focus on the documentation side. And we will actually making sure that, much of the thing that I'm talking about, we repackage them and we provide them to implementers as guidelines and receive feedback as well in terms of, how useful and implementable are those. And in terms of the invested white paper, we'll also want to contribute to the security white paper. This is really meant for, regulators, meant for, business people that wants to make, decisions around the trustworthiness of an open source platform. And Steve and Paul and I are working on this, and we should have this before, the mid-PI next PI. So in a nutshell, we're still, kind of like open. So if there's any kind of like objective or issue that any member of the community would like to see, those can actually be proposed to us and be added. And with that, Simeon, this actually marks the conclusion of my feedback. Thank you for listening.
Round of applause for Godfrey. All right, Godfrey, I have literally 2 minutes, so I will allow one question from the floor. One short question. I do not see a hand. Awesome.